India and Pakistan have just fought the largest airborne battle since the Second World War. Just what technology was used and what did air force-on-force conflict look like in the largest air battle since in nearly a century? Plus, whose technology is being fielded? Because this is, in a lot of cases, a first test of especially Chinese military tech. Did it pass the test, or is it more terrible Chinese copies of real Western products? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's get into it. Okay, so this is a crazy story because reportedly up to 125 Indian and Pakistani fighter jets battled for over an hour in one of the biggest dogfights in recent history. Now, I want to point out that the word dogfight is doing some work here because it's actually very interesting, right? This would be one of the largest air battles since the Second World War, if indeed it is true. And though things are so different from that Second World War, right? And in the Second World War, you saw aircraft would fight each other generally using machine guns mounted to prop-driven planes. There were very few jet fighters in the Second World War, and these large-scale airborne battles would be fought extremely close, right? But technology has evolved a lot over the last century, essentially. And as a result, this engagement was actually never fought. No one incurred in anyone else's airspace, right? The Indian fighters remained on the Indian side and the Pakistani fighters remained on the Pakistani side, and they engaged instead with long-range missiles at distances over 100 miles, what's called a beyond visual range engagement. And this is fascinating because essentially what you have is these pilots flying on instruments. They are relying on radar. They are relying on thermals to detect where their enemy is, and then they are simply deploying the missiles that will extend the last 100 miles of the engagement, presumably striking their targets, right? So this is a really fascinating change in sort of how air combat is fought. Again, it makes a lot of sense given the sophistication of technologies. It's one of the things that I find sort of interesting that, in a lot of cases, you have people both at the Pentagon and kind of outside the Pentagon, like Elon Musk, who scoff and say, oh man, fighter aircraft, they're going to get replaced with drones. And it's like, my brother in Christ, they are drones. Essentially, when you're talking about the final 100 miles of an engagement being conducted with a missile, what is a missile but simply a drone, right? It doesn't meaningfully distinguish itself from something like a Shahed. They both have automated guidance systems. They both are assigned a target from a human being, but then conduct themselves along a flight path, striking that target. The thing that makes the Shahed so interesting is that it's cheap as dirt, but again, when you're talking about airborne to airborne combat, it's not uncommon to see these kind of air-to-air missiles traveling these great distances beyond what a human being could possibly see and still identifying and seeking out their target. It's one of the reasons why when people talk about stealth fighters, that's part of the significance, right? If you could truly have a stealth aircraft that can deploy missiles, right? If it can become invisible to radar, then it never has to get within visual range to actually strike its targets, right? It can simply appear in enemy airspace very briefly, deploy its payload that can travel the last 100 miles, and then simply vanish from radar and disappear once again. So this is why the stealth aircraft are so valuable, but also they are so expensive. Now, before we talk about sort of who is making their aircraft and why this is such a bellwether for military technology in general, what's worth noting is that reportedly, Pakistan claims to have shot down, I think, 5 of the Indian fighter jets. But it's really hard to know, right? Because again, this is a situation in which the fighters, right, didn't see their enemies. They simply saw them likely vanish from radar, but fighters can vanish from radar for a variety of reasons. They can drop their altitude sufficiently low that they become invisible. They can simply return to, again, in this case, Pakistani or Indian airspace, beyond the ability of Pakistani radars to detect them. And so it's really hard to say if this resulted in any kind of meaningful casualties, or if this was more of these aircraft just sort of taking pot shots at each other, right? Very interesting stuff, though. Very tough to say. Now, this isn't the only aerial battle that we've seen. But before we talk about that, I wanted to talk about today's sponsor, Magic Mind. Now, Magic Mind, the other day, I actually had to record a podcast episode in the afternoon, and I still had to work out. And so I had already had my strike gum. I was already as caffeinated as I wanted to be. But after my workout, man, cognitively, I felt like I was exhausted. I felt like my brain was fried. I needed something to pick me up. And so I popped a Magic Mind, right? These things have a whole bunch of cool ingredients in them, all natural ingredients. But what I thought was most interesting is stuff like ashwagandha and the cordyceps, right? And after popping the Magic Mind, I really did feel more mentally clear. I was able to, I feel like, nail the podcast interviews. But I made sense, of course, that cordyceps were in Magic Mind because, again, they report not just improving exercise, but in some studies actually do improve some level of cognition, right? It's one of the reasons why the optimal bros, Silicon Valley folks who are so committed to maintaining optimal brain health really love cordyceps, right? So again, if you're interested in checking out Magic Mind, the link is in the description. There's also going to be a QR code on your screen that you can scan, and it'll get you 50% off. So thanks again to Magic Mind for sponsoring today's video. Okay, so now, here's what I thought was more interesting, is that India and Pakistan field a mishmash of equipment, which is fascinating for a bunch of reasons. But India, right, has been, of course, striking Pakistani targets, and Pakistan appears to be striking back against Indian targets, particularly in Kashmir. But both of these sides are fielding a real mishmash of equipment, right? We've talked about the fact that the Indians seem to use specialty Israeli drones, loitering munitions, sort of like an Israeli, making like a budget version of like a Reaper, or I think what's more accurate is a loitering munition, like a Russian. Oh my gosh, I want to call it a switchblade. It's not a switchblade. It's a Russian. You know what I'm talking about? The one with the crossed. I can just look it up. I can't believe this. Light munition, Russian. Nope. I'm looking for loitering munition. The Lancet. That's what it is. It's the Lancet, right? Here we go. Yeah, it's basically an Israeli clone of a Russian. Not a clone. It's an Israeli answer to the Russian Lancet. So a lot of these, right? You also have a lot of French Rafale jets. And of course, what's interesting is a lot of them are firing Chinese-made missiles. This makes sense, right? Because jets are expensive, but you buy them once and then you have them. And then instead, when you look at things like missiles, you're going to expect them to have a long working life, or a high turnover rate. And so being able to get them from China is interesting for a bunch of reasons, right? But what's fascinating is, again, I suspect that for China, for Chinese technology, this is one of their first combat tests, right? Now, Pakistan's Air Force, it points out, includes American F-16, French Mirages, and the Chinese-built J-10C, right? And a Chinese JF-17, which was developed jointly with Pakistan. And what's worth noting is, again, the J-10C is the Vigorous Dragon, God bless it, manufactured about 20 years ago, but it looks like, again, a pretty standard kind of workhorse, medium-weight, single-engine, multi-role aircraft, and again, operated by China and Pakistan almost exclusively. But again, one of the things I want to point out is that a lot of times people go, "Oh, these aircraft are out of date." But what's worth noting is that an aircraft is only out of date if it can't do on the battlefield what you need it to do. And the fact is that against something like Indian air defenses, it seems to be actually pretty adequate, right? So and because it's Chinese built and likely pretty close to a clone of some of, or at least borrows heavily from European aircraft, right? For example, here is the Dassault Mirage. You could see, again, a single engine Delta Wing 4th generation fighter. Looks to have borrowed quite a bit from, you can see there is the Chengdu. This actually looks like kind of an F-16 clone more than a Dassault clone, I think. But there's the J-10 and there's the Mirage. So yeah, I'm going to say that they are very similar, very similar. And so, right, but nobody really knows until now if the Chinese fighters can really hang, so to speak. And what's fascinating is that Pakistan also has a bunch of Chinese products in its arsenal, like the PL-12, PL-15. And these are Chinese jets firing Chinese munitions. And so if they were to chronically underperform in combat, it would deal a real blow to Chinese foreign military sales all over the world, right? And I think what's fascinating is that there's some geopolitics here too, because the Chinese also have a disputed border with India. China also views India as a potential regional rival, right? They both have large populations, a growing industry, right? And let's see if we can find it. GDP, China versus India, and both of them have a real hunger for raw materials, right? So let's see if we can find it here. So this is GDP China versus India. And you can see that, again, in 1996, they were almost identical in GDP. And now, of course, China has rocketed to $1.4 trillion, whereas India has, again, experienced tremendous growth in 20 years by almost any other country's standards. It's just not China. So you can see that while they view themselves as kind of a regional rival, in terms of population, it's true. In terms of military capacity, probably true. But in terms of economic output, it's not even close, right? And but if you're India, right, you don't want to source your weapons from China. That's a potential point of failure, given that China could become a rival to you. And so this kind of triangulation is to Pakistan's advantage, because Pakistan says, listen, China, you don't like India. We don't like India. There's almost no chance that Pakistan and China are going to go to war. So they say, listen, you should sell us cheap Chinese missiles. And that can be a disadvantage for India, because now it has to it's going to have a hard time sourcing that sort of technology from anywhere else in the world that cheap, right? The Chinese can just do it cheaper. And so India appears to have actually tried to sort of find workarounds, particularly relying on drones, right? In fact, both sides are reportedly relying heavily on Russian-style drone waves. Let's see if we can find this here. With Pakistan actually, India accusing Pakistan of firing 300 to 400 drones overnight. Now, Islamabad's like, this didn't happen. And one of the things that we've seen, again, if you don't have really robust military infrastructure, good radars, et cetera, you're not really going to be able to get the numbers spot on. But, right, India, of course, is like, well, we launched our own drones at air defense sites in Pakistan. So this feels more and more like at least a growing intensity tit-for-tat exchange between India and Pakistan. This doesn't seem like it's being off-ramped. And unfortunately, normally in these kind of situations, the world sort of relies on the United States, particularly because it has good relationships with both of these countries. It really hopes the U.S. will sort of step in and say, listen, you're both our friends. We both kind of need you guys. Unfortunately, the U.S.'s new stance is it's not our business. Literally, J.D. Vance saying, quote, not going to get involved in a war that's fundamentally none of our business. Now, I want to point out that, again, Mr. Peace President apparently only cares about establishing peace only cares about establishing peace when it benefits Russia, one of his benefactors. But this is really troubling because, again, normally the United States says, listen, India, Pakistan, you guys both depend on us for various reasons. And if you don't make nice about this, we are going to go. And for the U.S. to say, listen, we don't care, also is a carte blanche to say, listen, India and Pakistan, the U.S. doesn't really care who wins. We're not going to be mad or upset or worked up or sanction you, whether you annex Kashmir, whether you nuke Karachi, we don't care. And that apathy is almost as dangerous because it's empowering, right? It's sort of like, imagine if a teacher was to see two students getting ready to fight and that teacher was to go, hey, I don't care what you guys do. Well, the students are going to go, well, you were supposed to hold us back. And a lot of people piss and moan and say America can't be the world's policeman. But there's a difference between saying, hey, listen, like the U.S.'s job is not to be the world's police, but we do have a responsibility to make sure that our friends get along. It's more, again, like a teacher analogy or like being the manager of an organization, right? If two of your bartenders are about to fight, if you're the manager, you have to show up and be like, you two, stop it, right? If you're a parent, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You're not a cop, but you don't get to abandon your responsibility to make sure things are running smoothly, especially given the fact that these are two U.S. allies, right? Or, well, varying degrees of U.S. ally. And they are, really the U.S. threat is China, as we pointed out. China's exponentially larger than both of these countries combined. They are nuclear powers. The U.S. has an incentive to not normalize people nuking each other, right? Like sometimes living in a large, it's like, would it be good if the U.S. was to tariff the shit out of China, right? Say we're basically not doing business with China, but then to have India and Pakistan have a nuclear exchange? Well, India would take what was supposed to be an opportunity for India to finally industrialize, and instead is going to potentially squander it by having these nuclear exchanges. And so the United States has an incentive to say, stop it, you two. We need you. We need you both. So you need to behave. You need to stop fighting over fucking Kashmir, which has nothing, which is worthless. Get a grip on yourselves. So instead to have the U.S. go, not our problem, well, guys, unfortunately, it is our problem. That's the thing. As much as it's like your neighbor's house being on fire. You'd love to sit there and say, listen, I don't care what happens to my neighbor's house. It's not my house. It's their house. But fire doesn't care, right? It spreads. That's what fire does. And your house is in danger because your neighbor's house is burning. And again, that doesn't mean that I own my neighbor's house, that I have to cut his grass for him, that I have to police everything he does. No, but it means that at a certain point, I have a responsibility my responsibility to safeguard my own house means where it makes sense, safeguarding my neighbor's house. And that means that when you see a little smoke coming out of the chimney, or you look through, you catch that their oven's still on, or they left a stove on, you do something. You call them and you say, guys, turn off your fucking stove. Anyway, that's really all I had. Thank you to all of our Colonel tier members like Bill Collier, Robin Colburn, Gauss Martin, Gina Cresta, Chris Gorsuch, Francis Cars, L90 Petro, and Jalen Gao. All of our Lieutenant tier members. I couldn't do it without you guys. And thanks to Magic Mind, today's sponsor. Check that link in the description. See you in the next one. Cheers.